Thank you to Carnegie and the other organisers. It's a privilege to be here. It's particularly a privilege to speak after Bahiyuddin Hassan. And really at this moment, as someone who has worked to promote human rights and democracy in Egypt and the Middle East for several decades now, our thoughts are with those in Egypt who have led that struggle over those decades, who have been so helpful and gracious to us over the years and are now taking great risks to move the issue forward in a substantive way and in hopefully an exciting and positive way in the coming weeks. I have really 2 points that I want to make. The second point will lead into a discussion about US policy and where we need to go from here. The first one is a more general point about the human rights movement in Egypt and the way it has developed over the last 30 years, really. When I first started going to Egypt, in the 1980s, it was a very different kind of movement than it is today. It was much smaller. It was much older people, tended to be lawyers, some former politicians, and they had limited objectives, I think, and limited expectations of what was possible within the framework of the Egyptian state. And it's only relatively recently, and I'm talking about really probably since the 2005 elections, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, that there's been a change in the ambition and the nature, I think, of the human rights movement. I've been going out of my way in my recent trips to Egypt to meet with these younger activists who are not connected with groups like the Cairo Institute or the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights, but they have their own new organizations, new networks, and they're involved much more in outreach to the general public, and they're also interested in street demonstrations as a tactic and as a way of advancing political freedoms. This tactic was often ridiculed and doubted by more experienced people within the Egyptian human rights movement who would observe that, well, yes, they can maybe put 50 people on the street, but they're quickly surrounded by 200 riot policemen, and it doesn't really have much impact. But I think we are seeing with the events that started on the 25th that the networks which they have been able to put in place, largely recently through the elections, there were networks, thousands of people established by some of these organizations throughout the country taking part voluntarily in election monitoring efforts. These networks have shown their value, and when the time came, they were able to mobilize a significant number of people onto the streets, and a tipping point was reached. And as Amr noted, the Egyptian people have regained the streets for the first time since 1919, was I think what Amr observed. So that's a qualitative change, and it's a change which has partly come about through the maturation of the Egyptian human rights movement, and people like Bahi are the fathers. I won't call him the grandfather; that will be unkind. But the fathers of that movement. But
maybe mother.
but we are, seeing a very welcome proliferation in a number of activists and a widening in scope of their ambitions, and obviously real achievements in recent days, and that is very much to be welcomed. And the final important point about that is that, as in Tunisia, the change that is coming in Egypt was done indigenously, was done by people themselves in Egypt. It was not something initiated by America or the West or any other kind of foreign agency.
Tell that to Egyptian television, please.
That's why I hope they're listening. This court, as an instigator and a suspicious foreign agent who goes to Egypt and tries to start this kind of thing, I didn't do it. I didn't know about it, and it was as surprising to us as it is to everybody else. But I think that's obviously its strength. This is authentic. It comes from the people, and that needs to be underlined. Now let me move on to US policy and how, our basic critique of the administration and of the US government is that they are behind the curve on this. we just had some meetings this morning on the Hill, and we were saying that it seems to us that the administration is a day behind events and that Congress is a day behind the administration. In President Mubarak's speech on Tuesday evening, where he made this famous choice between stability or chaos, I think that was widely misunderstood. Instead of being a promise that he could bring stability, I think it was more of a threat that if you didn't go my way, then I would bring chaos. And indeed, that is what Mubarak has done in these last few days. Just to reflect a moment on some of the steps that he has taken to clearly, this is a extremely draconian and heavy-handed measure, which has been enormously damaging to commerce and business interests in Egypt. The tourists have all been sent home. The tourism industry has been devastated. I don't think it's too strong a word. The losses to the Egyptian economy from that must be enormous. But even before those measures and the violence, of course, that has been used against protesters, even before those measures of the last few days, there were signs, I think, that President Mubarak's regime was fraying in its ability to maintain the stability for which it was valued. The rigged elections in November, which people have referred to, were themselves, I think, a sign of incompetence and panic from the administration, a sign of weakness, which should have had a stronger response than they received from the US administration. And we have seen, of course, gruesome incidents of police brutality, the killing of Khalid Said in Alexandria, who was beaten to death in the street by police officers. And that indeed has been a mobilizing factor for young people in Egypt. It was very much linked to the question of internet freedom. The argument with the police officer broke out in an internet cafe and became symbolic of the freedom which the younger generation in Egypt is demanding and which the Mubarak government has been denying them. And another indicator, I think, of the fraying of authority and competence of the Mubarak regime has been the rise in sectarian tensions and the attacks on Christians that we have seen, and the failure, really, of the Mubarak government to hold people accountable for those incidents of violence and incitement against minority religious communities. So I think now there's a clear choice facing US policymakers, and it's a choice which the administration has been running away from. I think Mubarak's recent actions destroyed really any possibility of pretending that there is a democratic facade to the Egyptian government as we knew it. And I think the choice now is either Mubarak stays in power as the Mugabe of North Africa, or there has to be a move to a new transitional government which can lead us to democratic elections and a new government which will be meet the legitimate interests of the Egyptian people. So that implies, I think, and requires that the administration should make clear that it no longer has faith in President Mubarak as any kind of leader in a transitional process. Ammar was very optimistic, and I was pleased to hear that in his analysis of the transitional role being played by Omar Suleiman. It remains to be seen whether that will be accepted by the opposition. But if there can be this agreement whereby Mubarak is sidelined, if not ejected, and that is sufficient, then that obviously will be an optimistic thing. But this kind of, but the absolute need for the change, meaning the exit from power of President Mubarak, is something which the administration should be embracing clearly, rather than just hinting at and suggesting. There are two other pressing current issues which I would like to see stronger public messaging from the administration. Bahi referred to the humanitarian crisis, or the potential for humanitarian crisis in the streets of Cairo. Again, AMRA optimistically suggested that we might not be seeing a major demonstration tomorrow and a major confrontation. Nonetheless, we still have troops in the streets and we have demonstrators on the streets, and the possibility for further violence, for killing of demonstrators by the armed forces and other security forces is present. And the administration needs to be making sure that that catastrophe is not allowed to happen, and that it's very clearly understood by military leadership in Egypt that the consequences of any involvement in killing of peaceful demonstrators would be severe, and the relationship with the US military would suffer accordingly, both in terms of aid and in terms of close cooperation that they currently enjoy. And finally, there have been these raids on human rights organizations that we've seen today. The Hisham Mubarak Law Center in downtown Cairo was raided in a very violent manner, it seems. A number of their staff members and other human rights activists gathered there have been detained. We have lists of names of human rights defenders and journalists who have been taken into detention. These people must be released, and the US government should be front and center calling for their release.